Friends of the Awakening series, where we seek to infuse the movement with voices, resources, and inspiration for today's challenges. I'm your host, Jerry Davison, today, and I have the pleasure of being with Michael Guzman. Michael, great to have you with us today. So,
Man,
Michael's
so glad to be here.
Good to be with you, Michael. So, Michael's a media resource pastor for Church of God Northwest.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, that's right. That's good stuff. Michael and Kimberly own Riverview Kennels in Bandon, Oregon. It's a dog and cat daycare and boarding facility.
Yeah.
Michael also serves on the board at Warner Pacific University. So, Michael, it's great to have you with us today.
Yeah, so good to be here. It's kind of interesting to hear some of my credentials read back like that. I'm rooted here in Oregon and Southwest Washington. That's pretty cool. It's been fun. Brand new to the board at Warner Pacific. I just had my first board meeting, but I'm excited for the possibility of just being there representing the movement at a wider level for this particular season for Warner. So yeah, thanks, Jerry.
Yeah, you bet. Great to have you on. So our last conversation, we busted out that new name, right?
We did.
CHOG Northwest, Church of God Northwest, and we're so excited to kind of unveil that and to see where that goes, where that takes our movement. So we had that conversation about kind of how that all came about through our conversations and through just multi levels of conversations.
Yeah.
Got a lot of input, and so today we're going to move on to a conversation about vision. So with that new name came kind of a rethinking about, where we're headed. So, Michael, I'm excited for you to lead us through this presentation about vision and kind of where we're going.
Yeah,
so,
thanks, Jerry. Appreciate it. Yeah, I'm going to take over the screen like I did on that last one, just because there's quite a bit of, copy and language that I think is good for people to be able to see. And then even just a front load about this particular presentation, like this, it represents a lot of thoughts that I've been putting together out of the various conversations our district team has had, district council, all of that. So it kind of comes together and again provides some sense of evidence of like the logical trail to the decisions. So versus just like, hey, here it is. Are you ready? I think what I'm hoping is that provides people a sense of substance back to it so that they can see that it's not just on a whim, but also, it gives people a chance to be able to potentially challenge areas of thinking in there too. So I actually look forward to that potential dialogue. I had laid out this particular presentation, though it's adapted from the original slightly, is this was what I used at the district council meeting as we talked it all through. And I invited them, especially as you'll see some historical timeline notes, I invited them, hey, I may have gotten some of these wrong. I wasn't here. And so I didn't get any of that feedback or correction. I got one spelling correction from a different slideshow, which I really appreciate too. But I think what that does is that creates more of that conversational tone along the way, but still allows for decision, to be made.
It's a fantastic journey that you took us on at that council retreat. And I'm excited for you to kind of roll that out to a wider audience. You might get more than some spelling corrections, but
I know, right? So watch for it, Jerry. It may be there. So let me do this, get a couple things in place for
Michael's
this.
taking over.
I know, right there. That could be a
common theme. It is a new name.
Yeah, there it is. So yeah, we talked about that last time. Church of God Northwest. This particular presentation is on vision, and I think to front load maybe two other things that are top of mind right now. One is that I'm going to end up talking about a lot of, I'm going to try to take Church of God, Oregon, Southwest Washington history and weave that together with United States history to allow us to see where we are right now in 2024 in a wider sense. For me, it was really insightful to kind of follow that journey and see the way that decisions were made. And so I think to, even front load that I am going to present, I'll give links and stuff like that to the resources that I use to substantiate that stuff. like the Library of Congress. And so I think, just to state up front, the history I'm going to dig into is United States history written from the United States, as positive and good as a lot of it is, it's also filled with a lot of baggage. And so you may feel like, as you hear this presentation, I'm trying to glaze over or skipping over. I'm trying not to. So that might be part of the conversation I invite back. We've got a checkered history with people of color in
Yeah, we
Oregon in
definitely
particular. So you're going to hear and see some of that. I think as you look at the wider picture of the United States, we've got the question of slavery, and the way that plays into acts that we do, like with the Civil War. And then you've got the displacement of, the Native Americans that were here first. And so I'm not ignoring that, but I think I am choosing to start from that angle of the United States history. And then all of the other things, critiques that may come from it can flow from there. So I think that's at least number one that I want to start with. And then I guess number two is, I had prepped the district council on this too, like, hey, get prepared for a marathon, because I
yeah.
think it's not so much that this decision merits a marathon, but the history that I'm going to walk through, it is quite in depth. And so if you need to take a break or something like that when you're watching this slideshow, I completely get it. So here's the journey and how I kind of arrived there. So we've got this name, Church of God Northwest, is the one that we've landed on. And where that took me next is, like Jerry had talked about, vision. How do we articulate our, kingdom calling, our kingdom vision for change in the Pacific Northwest, in Oregon and Southwest Washington, where we, have a realm of responsibility and authority. The other piece is, I like to see these things complemented together, vision and values playing well together. So another secondary question that I'm not going to talk about today, although technically there are elements of it that infuse throughout, but just like, what kind of covenantal values will hold us together as we pursue this kingdom vision. So that's the lenses that I think I started this from. What I'd like to do to lay the groundwork is to look at the gospel, but look at it in a bit of a wider lens. And so I may step on some toes even here. So we'll see how this goes across. But as I look back at my own history and realize getting introduced to the gospel, I think I received a very simple gospel at a young age of Jesus coming, dying, being buried, raised from the dead, and that um, crucifixion, resurrection was the like 1-2 punch of the gospel, even kind of the beginning and the end of the gospel. And I think it is the central piece of it. But as I've gone back and I've had time from that very young age to unpack the scriptures, what I notice is that's not the gospel that Jesus communicated in the autobiographical accounts that we call the gospels, that he told. And so I've spent a bit of time reading resources, books, and looking at the scriptures through the lenses of the gospel of the kingdom, because that's the language that Jesus used, which is just, in a sense, it includes the crucifixion and the resurrection, and they are the central pieces of it, but it's just so much bigger. And I found that what happens is my evangelistic call to respond to the gospel of the kingdom is it's so much easier to invite people into a life of discipleship when it's the gospel of the kingdom versus just crucifixion and resurrection alone. So here's some scriptures we'll dive into. Mark's account, the shorter gospel account, he starts off with this. These are some of Jesus' first words in his proclamation of his mission. He says, "The time has come, the kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe the good news." And so, I mean, you can look back all Old Testament, accounts, longing for Messiah to come, the silent years in between the testaments, like you can feel the groaning of the time has come, this moment for change, this kairos, because it's kairos, not chronos, is the kind of time he's talking about. This kairos moment for change has finally come. All of creation has been waiting for this. And then what he says as this moment comes is the kingdom of God has come near. And so you think of the king his kingship, his rule, his domain has come, his influence has come, and it's come near. It's not come distant, it's not far off, it's come near. And so, like, the king is here, he's good, and he's really close to you, and he's inviting you to come closer to him. And so, what Jesus says with his announcement of the kingdom of God is he says, what you should do in light of the king and kingdom being near is that you should repent and believe this good news. And so turn to the king and then live as if this radical idea is true. So I really like Mark's account of it. This is language that's like deeply saturated into my mind and heart and has been really helpful for me. So Luke picks up language that Jesus uses around the gospel of the kingdom. And this is, super important. I'm sure many of us have preached sermons on this, multiple times, but this is Jesus. He's back in his hometown, Nazareth. It's, he's in synagogue. He's handed the scroll. He reads this passage that I'll read in just a moment from Isaiah, and then he applies it back to his own life and calling, his messiahship. So he says, the Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. This is all Jubilee language from the Old Testament that he's pulling forth, from this Old Testament quote and then applying it to himself. And so this kingdom of God, good news, this is what it looks like. It's not just that the king is good and he's near, but look at people are like loads of great things are happening.
Yeah.
The poor are receiving this. The oppressed are receiving liberation. The blind are gaining sight. I mean, there's just so many beautiful things that are loaded inside of it. And so, in a lot of ways, this is like the what of Jesus's kingdom of God proclamation and the gospel of it. And then I did a study a couple of years back just analyzing especially Luke's account of the gospels and like what Jesus does and the particular way he frames the narrative. And it's interesting. You can go back and analyze. It's almost like Luke uses all of the narrative stories to prove each one of those lines. So you constantly are watching good news preached to the poor, proclamation for freedom and prisoners, recovery of sight of the blind, people being that are oppressed set free. It's actually really cool. It's almost like the lens that Luke used to say, okay, this is how I'm going to write the biography of Jesus. Another interesting point is that this passage of scripture is the singular passage in Church of God ministry, like governing documents. And so if you kind of look back at like our movement, and this is, not like at its earliest foundations, but our current iterations, the people who architected, our Church of God ministries placed this as like our kingdom call in it. So I do think it has some profound resonance for us as a movement as a whole. So Luke moves from here, Jesus is rejected then as he says that. So it's good news, but he faces persecution from his own biological family, from his neighbors that he had grown up and around. And he turns from there and he goes to hang out with his buddies that he had already spent some time with. And so he heads over to, Peter and Andrew's house. He does some amazing ministry there, basically demonstrates that gospel of the kingdom, heals people, all of that. The house is packed. And then he wakes up the next morning. He's out spending some quiet time with the Lord. The other disciples don't know where he is. They find him and they're like, Jesus, like, we can't wait for day 2. Day 1 was so awesome. And yeah, right. I totally understand. I probably would have been saying the same thing. Listen, we figured out a way to like make more room for more people. But Jesus, it seems, you got to read in between the lines, it seems that like he's receiving new intelligence, new information from the Father. As he said things like, I only do the things that I see the Father doing. I only say the things that I hear the Father saying. And so his answer, instead of, hey, let's go back and do bigger and better day 2, he says, I must proclaim the gospel or the good news of the kingdom of God to the other towns also, because that's why I was sent. So he really is living out this initiative of gospel of the kingdom motive and operation.
Yeah.
So he turned from there. Nope, we're not going to do that, guys. We're going to go do this thing. And again, just notice the echo of the gospel of the kingdom. Matthew's account, kind of taking, this isn't precisely in chronological order, but a little bit of comparison here. Jesus goes through Galilee teaching in the synagogue. So use those typical practices and patterns as places to be able to engage with people. And notice what he does: proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, healing every disease and sickness among the people. So he's proclaiming, the gospel, but he's also demonstrating the gospel. Mm-hmm. So again, just to couch all of this vision stuff back into this gospel of the kingdom language, I think this is stuff that's important for us to contend to. If all we communicate is crucifixion and resurrection, it's true and is the central piece of the gospel. But again, where I'm trying to get at, this is what Jesus proclaims, and it's so much bigger. It includes the crucifixion and resurrection, but it's so much bigger here. So I'll kind of pause before I move on to the next stuff there. Any thoughts or comments or even pushback you want to bring, Jerry?
Yeah, no, this really resonates with me. In my journey with a missional church, there's a big call to kingdom, going out and proclaiming, not only proclaiming, but demonstrating the kingdom out into our communities. And it's interesting to me, growing up in the Church of God, there was a lot of talk about, that one encounter that Jesus had with Nicodemus when he said, you must be born again. A lot of talk about being born again, and not a lot of talk about the kingdom. And, as you lay out here and as you read the Gospels with that kind of lens, it's interesting how much talk there is about the kingdom.
Yeah,
and the kingdom
absolutely.
coming. And I think part of my issue was that I didn't necessarily understand what the kingdom was. Nobody when I was growing up described to me what the kingdom was, right? It was the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven. So I just thought, well, it's, some other place. But Reggie McNeil just nailed it for me when he gave a definition of the kingdom: life as it was meant to be. Back in the garden. Perfect.
Yeah, I totally hear you. And I think I had received, in a sense, a similar understanding. And it almost placed it back, like, remember that one day that I surrendered my life to Jesus,
right?
That born again time frame. And it always kept it in the past. It wasn't ever present. But when it's life as God intended, or this much bigger picture, then what happens is, like, it applies in every day and every moment of the day. It's not just that, I repented and believed the good news back in 1967 or whatever your day might have been, but I'm continuing to repent and believe the good news today, because I've got to keep turning to the King and the kingdom. So it's this perpetual repentance and belief, living into like more and more of it. So that's
and as important as that time when I first repented, first turned my life to Jesus. That's, we're not at all saying that that's not important, but it's a continual.
Thanks for saying that too. It's not that it's not important, but it's just not the singular moment. I may return back to it, and I hold that testimony that I carry very dearly, but I have fresh testimony from this year, from this month, from honestly from last night. There were just great conversations where I'm like, man, I need to continue to just turn in this direction. I want to see that from glory to glory to glory transformation continue to take place, in my life. So, awesome. All right. So that's I guess, if you will, the foundation as we're looking at vision, especially because it's about how will we articulate this kingdom call for the association. And then to now begin to take it a little bit more practical and to frame it around maybe even the chapter we find ourselves in. This is from the book of Acts. And this is Paul speaking. He started his first missionary journey now, and he's summarizing, the gospel as he communicates it here. And he uses this one sentence. It's like a summary of David's life. and as an application point for everybody else. And it's so profound that I think it's a really good lens to be able to look at. But so he says this. Now, when David had served God's purpose in his own generation, he fell asleep. He was buried with his ancestors, and his body decayed. So it's like just a picture of, in this case, David's life, but you could extrapolate that and say it's a picture of everybody's life. It may not be that everybody serves the purposes of God in their generation, but this is the call of kingdom people to do that. And so I think this gave me a bit of, an angle to say, well, what are the purposes of God today? Because they are different than what D.S. Warner faced. It's not that the world has changed so much and the gospel has changed, but the world around us has changed and the application for it. And so serving God's purposes today is going to look different than it did in the 40s. It's going to look different than it did in the 1880s. So I think we've got to use that. So that serving God's purposes in our generation I think is an important one. What are those purposes and how do we step into that? So thinking of, uh, leading forward and change, especially changing important things like vision and values. I don't take that stuff lightly. As much as I love to engage with those things, I've had the chance to, kind of be a wordsmith and architect in a few different places that way. I, learned this the hard way, casting vision for change from the root, because I've definitely cast vision for change. I really like leading in change, but I found that especially like, our space in a Church of God context that, people don't always like change to be imposed upon them, and especially if it feels foreign. And so I had to, at Church of God Exeter, go back and do research into like, who have we been over the course of the generations? What were our, founders thinking during that time frame? And then how do we emulate that stuff so that the vision that I'm leading into isn't foreign from that, but founded out of it? And so, yeah, there's some hard lessons and scars that I, have from that time frame. But this has really been a word from the Lord for me as I seek to do whatever it happens to be, whether it's leading in change at the kennel. We've faced that, Kimberly and I, and pushback from people. So we've had to go back and try to cast vision from change from there. Another piece, we just had that Carl Vader's conference, helping small churches thrive, which was just amazing. I really appreciated Carl's love for the small church, the way he edified the small church, spoke so well of it. It really helped even check some things that I think I've received and inherited and walked in. But he had said this: don't do what your founders did. Think like your founders thought. I've been in Church of God long enough that I have heard a lot of people say, let's just go back and we need our hymnal to be, repurposed. We need to go back and let's have camp meeting. Or, maybe somebody's going to go back, we need flying bands, or we need mission homes. Those were really beautiful iterations for that particular generation. And some of them lasted longer than others. But doing what your founders did isn't the right thing. That was a particular application out of a thought process. So I really liked that thinking like your founders thought was an important part. And so I had already been in some of this process. And so I was at your house, Jerry. You and I and Fred were there for that conference. And I saw this book on the left-hand side there at your house, Truth Along the Trail, and was excited. One, because of all the pictures and the rich history that's there. But just to hear the story that's particular to this association. So I've gone through, dug in deep, and read all of that, lots of notes and stuff like that. So that really largely informed some of the next stages of this. And then as I was sharing some of this with our district team, Paula had then brought up, hey, have you heard of Pioneer Evangelists of the Pacific Northwest? And so there's actually an online digital copy that's available for free to dig in. I'm in the beginning parts of it. It's John Green's story, our founding pioneer for Oregon, Southwest Washington, and his biographical account of it. It's really, really well done. It's you can see written in 1940. He started his work, before the 1900s began, and so it really is a fresh perspective from him looking back and kind of telling the story. So that's places I've gone to figure out, well, what are our founders thinking? So as I looked into that, there were two concepts that really seemed to surface in my mind that were really helpful, both pioneering and developing. You can see it in the title, Pioneering Evangelist, but you can see literally that pioneering work from that particular era of expansion the United States was going through. But also you can see, and John Green in particular carries this, he develops things. And he does really well. There's some key differences between those. Pioneering, is about risk taking. So he leaves his Midwest family and home, he and his wife, and they travel across. They land, in Woodburn. They're innovative. They're trying new things. They started off with what do they call it? A cottage prayer meeting. The very first day they arrived, that night, cottage prayer meeting. They're meeting in homes and they're looking and responding to things. They're using gospel trumpet. They're handing them out to people. They're increasing subscriptions, even, so to speak. They're finding people who have already heard, word from the gospel trumpet, and they're looking to gather people and really quickly planted a church. So you can see all that pioneering initiative, but they also did this kind of stuff, which is development. They operated in this really beautiful rootedness. Like, I don't know that John stayed in Woodburn the whole entire time, but he did return back to that like central northern area of Oregon, went over to the coast for periods of time, went up into Portland, but seemed to return back. So you can just see that there's a commitment, a rootedness, resourceful, because they didn't have a Costco to turn to figure out how to provide for themselves. And so they were really looking for ways to be able to extend the kingdom and develop it further, and then just highly committed. I'm really impressed with the level of commitment that our founders operated. And so this lens, as we start to turn to look at our history in a timeline form and, couched back in U.S. history, I think are really important lenses to look at. And I'll try to use some of this language even to draw elements of it along the way. So any other thoughts, Jerry, as we get ready to turn?
Just what would you say to someone who said, "Oh, pioneering is such archaic language"?
Yeah, I think I'd agree. I'd say, yeah, you're right. It does come from a particular era. I think what's going to happen is it depends on who you're talking to. If you use pioneering language and it's a Trekkie, they're going to go, oh yeah, that's science fiction. And so now it's future oriented in that sense. It's beyond our time frame. If you say it to somebody and couch it like you're going to hear me say around Lewis and Clark's journey and all that, then you're going to go back to old times and you're going to think covered wagon. And so I don't think that minimizes the language, because I think if you take pioneering out of its context, it is perpetually about pressing forward into something new. And so pioneering has been required in communication. We've lived in this radical transformation in the world around us where people pioneered communication initiatives. So they've pioneered, right now AI is being pioneered and developed. And so I think if you pull it out of its historical context and look at it truly just as in the definition, it's perpetually about forward movement into new territory, but then the need for, and you'll hear me get at this later on, the need for mature development so that you don't lose the new ground. Give me some thoughts on what you're hearing me say there.
Going where no one has gone before.
Yeah, right.
That's pioneering, right? Yeah, absolutely. We see it. We see it all over tech industry.
Yep.
We call it innovation, but it's really at its roots pioneering. I resonate with that language.
So, yeah, good. I hear you. Yeah, I mean, think about there's a vision to go to Mars for humanity, and I know that there's all kinds of there's all kinds of thoughts around that. Whether it's who's the one initiating that or, but I think there's just a pioneering spirit that's inside of people, exploration. I think that when we come to the end of pioneering maybe a geographic region, I think we've seen that in recent decades, there is people are looking for, well, where's the new horizon? to go toward.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't always have to be geographic. I think that is the language around the covered wagon version of pioneering, but it does extend outside of that.
Yeah, no, it's good.
Nice. All right, so what I'd like to do is just walk through again this kind of extensive timeline of United States history. I've got sources that I'll use QR codes so you can go back and look at it. I've got them listed here, but I've got links so that anybody can go back and see. In fact, the Library of Congress website is phenomenal. I'm simply scratching the surface and using some of the broadest categories that they use to just group these 13 eras. And so
That's
the
good.
library.
I'm gonna sit back in my chair and grab my coffee. Get ready for
Do
this.
it.
Okay.
Do it. Do it.
Let's do
Yep.
it.
So the Library of Congress only goes up to a certain point. If I'm remembering correctly, it's 1979, and they end their eras at that point. So to get beyond 1979, again, if I'm correct on that, whatever that time frame that caps them, I had to turn to Wikipedia. So I used them. They're, just like what you know about Wikipedia, there's a variety of naming or grouping strategies used there. So I used that as a source and then really even kind of created my own out of it. But if you were to go back, you'd be able to see some of the logic that I employed there. But ultimately, we're going to look at 13 chapters of the United States history. So here's chapter 1. This is colonial settlement. Go back to your elementary education and what you remember from colonial settlement. And that's the 1600s to 1763. So you've got all of this exploration. Pioneering is definitely a part of this idea, development. You've got all kinds of motives going on. A lot of it is expansion for new land. There's a search for spices, for trade routes. There's a search for gold. So you have a whole mixture of human motives in there. Some of them have valor, and some of them are very sinful. In the middle of all this, you carry every ounce of baggage that humanity can carry. And so slavery plays a part in this earliest days, conquest, displacement of people. And there are mindsets that, inform it. So it's interesting as you dig in a little bit deeper, two things that kind of play in and dovetail into our history from this chapter is that it's from 1730 to 1735, you get the First Great Awakening. So in the midst of this expansion and growth and moral depravity, that you end up having this hunger for and return to God and this awakening, this revival that takes place. You've got a lot of voices, a lot of new strategies are being deployed, again, serving God's purposes for their generation. And a particular thread of our roots as, Wesleyan Arminian. Here's John Wesley's class meeting systems beginning during that time frame. Interesting quote that I'm sure many of you guys know is that both Wesley and Whitefield, who were contemporaries, Whitefield was a bit more of the celebrity status. Maybe you could say better communicator, larger response. If he had an Instagram following, it would be bigger than Wesley's. Wesley was the one who did some of those same things, but Whitefield said he approved of Wesley's strategy because he captured the fire. And so other thinkers have said the fire of revival is captured by the form, and you need a form for it to fit into. Because again, I think this goes back to the way that we talked about gospel of the kingdom versus just, born again. If it's just an experience of conversion, that comes and potentially goes unless it's discipled and stewarded well. And Wesley, utilizing class systems and bringing his methods to the table, really did a whole bunch to have a container for that fire to fall in and grow in. And so made a huge difference there.
Yeah, it's really good.
American Revolution is the next chapter. This is 1763 to 1783. And so again, foundings of, our country and nation, this grand experiment. And the singular part I'll point out in this time frame is 1776, the Declaration of Independence. So a radical shift from being a colony of England to ended up, declaring independence from. But even think about some of those founding documents and the philosophy that's utilized
Mhm.
to undergird that. Those are important, formative decisions that are being made and lived out that we're still either facing the consequences or receiving the benefit of. Third era is the new nation. And so now, after revolution, it's this fledgling young nation and experiment. Will it really work? And so, 83 to 1815 is what you've got here. You've got some important foundational steps. In 1790, the Constitution is ratified, and so now there's architecture to be able to build from. It's doesn't have everything it needs. So you've got the Bill of Rights ratified and then extended, as time goes on from there. But you also have in the midst of it a second Great Awakening. That's 1790 to 1840. There are varying degrees of time frame used for that
Mhm.
particular one. Another part that plays directly into Oregon and Southwest Washington is the Louisiana Purchase
Yeah.
happens then. So because of France's bankruptcy and gambling, if you will, what we find is we end up getting the port of New Orleans and all of the territory of Louisiana from the French for a pretty fair amount of money. I don't remember the final. I had it in one iteration of my
Mhm.
slideshow, but it was like pennies on the acre
Wow.
for that. And then shortly after that, Thomas Jefferson sends Lewis and Clark. They depart from St. Louis and they head out looking for that waterway, that
Mhm.
route to the Pacific. And so they, took off, expecting to go upstream and then hit the top of the hill and then use their canoes to go all the way down and slide
Yeah.
into the Pacific Ocean. And it's a really interesting, story and journey. There's
Yeah.
again all kinds of intrigue and amazing parts, the way that they receive help from native tribes along the way, and there's a lot of just beautiful things. So you can see pioneering and developing, and even conceptually behind all of those things. And then you get into this expansion and reform. So from 1815 to 1880, I think because of the groundwork laid in exploring that initially, being the very first kind of pioneers there were fur traders and things going into that area. But then what happens is you have a next wave of people coming. And so again, we were talking this earlier. This is some of that imagery. Notice the covered
Mhm.
wagon, the
Yeah.
horses, the guns. You're seeing bison, you're seeing Native Americans, and is that, are they being positively treated? I'm looking at the image, or are they being negatively
Mhm.
treated? It's kind of difficult to tell for certain. There might be some hand waves there, but there's some
Right.
brutal stories from this
Yeah.
time frame, and some of this comes from this that I get into. This is really like the cultural seedbed of our movement. So our movement finds its like origins out of this particular generation serving their purposes. You've got the Oregon Trail migration. So now people are at great risk traveling across with the hopes of coming to the promised land of Oregon. And then you've got Manifest Destiny. It had been an operating system that empowered this white conquest.
Mhm.
And so there are faulty, pieces of logic in there, but it was eventually coined and like put into popular culture, I guess you could say, 1845. And so that is governing a lot of this expansion and
Mhm.
why it was, right in their eyes to be able to kill the buffalo, because that affected the native population, to treat the native population poorly. And again, it wasn't singularly the way that people operated. There were some people that operated in great honor and valor toward the native population as they went through. But again, that informs a lot of the way things operated. You do get arguably a third Great Awakening that happens there, 1855 to 1930. And then for Oregon, Oregon becomes a free state. So as America is
Mhm.
expanding, as states are developing, that free state is a really important piece, because by this point, um, those kind of founders and builders are trying to figure out, how do we keep this harmony, because there's a divide that's occurred inside of the United States on the topic of slavery. And so
Mhm.
Oregon is technically a free state, and so that means that slavery will not be a part of its future, But it's so interesting because Oregon, in its earliest constitution, saw themselves as a white utopia. They
Mhm.
actually, in the Constitution for Oregon, did not want any people of color. So there were laws that were in the books that if somebody, as a free state, let's say that somebody with slaves came to Oregon traveling across to get there, they arrived with their states. The positive would be in Oregon, those people were immediately emancipated.
Mhm.
That the free state part of it, but because of that constitution of it being this white utopia, then any of those now freed slaves had 5 days to leave the state. If they didn't leave the state, they could, if I remember correctly, receive minimum of 25 lashes and up to
Wow.
39 lashes. And if that didn't work to remove them, 6 months later, they could receive the same penalty. So you get this like,
Mhm.
heartbreaking, so mixed up and confused parts of our origin and history that are there. And then you get 1869, this technological development, transcontinental railroad allows for now safer and faster travel. That plays a huge part in John Green's story because that's how they arrive
Mhm. Yeah.
in much more safety by the time that they come here. So then you get into this Civil War and Reconstruction. So that wedge in the United States comes to hemorrhage and divides the country. We know the kind of many of the stories around Civil War that take place here. And then, notice how it's coupled together. It's Civil War, then on the side of slavery now, in the Emancipation Proclamation coming out, you end up with this now. How will we reconstruct and rebuild
Mhm.
this divided nation? So you've got the Civil War from 61 to 65, again, our bloodiest years in American history. You get the Emancipation Proclamation in 62, so in the middle of that Civil War. So it affects people, and it's a part of how Lincoln, in particular, walked out his particular serving God's purposes in his generation. And then right at the end of the war, we know Lincoln's assassinated. And so all of the possibility of his leadership in building and developing on the other side are eliminated. And so reconstruction efforts, there are efforts, but man,
Mhm.
we get again this sinful mixture of human, you could say maybe corruption, that
Mhm.
play out what reconstruction looks like. And so again, this is like really now, these are parts that are influencing our founding leaders during this time frame, the rise of industrial America. So you got more technological advancements. It's not so much about farmers and multiple farmers. Now we've got cities and industry that is rising from 1876 to 1900. Really, as Church of God is formed, 1881, that's
Mhm.
what is commonly used as like our founding year. What's
Yeah.
interesting with D.S. Warner is that this isn't Warner's like beginning into ministry. He's got a few iterations before this. And so he, runs with and partners with others. The one right before 1881 was the Winebrenarians, and
Mhm.
he's playing with them. And yet he it seems like, in my view of his story, he runs with a group of people and then ends up finding something that he believes in and almost puts like everything on. In
Yeah.
that case, it was entire sanctification. And
Mhm.
because the Winebrenarians weren't for that, he separates. And so
Yeah.
you do see this like
Yeah.
pattern of separating from Warner. This is the one that we look back at as our founding, so 1881. And then I just think it's interesting, just 12 years later,
Mm.
here are people under the influence of Warner and the gospel trumpet. They, take the John and Lydia Green, arrive in Woodburn on that transcontinental railroad, and here they are. They're coming as a flying band in a way to come extend the gospel of the kingdom of God and the one true church that
Yeah.
the Church of God carried to call people out to come out of sect
Mhm.
Babylon. And
Yep.
it's during that time frame and era that the first two churches are planted in Oregon and Southwest Washington. And so you get the beginning of what becomes our future association. You get the progressive era. Now think about cultural changes that are taking place. We've got technological changes that inform the Industrial Revolution, but now you've got new thoughts and new ideas. You can see suffragettes here in a
Mhm.
parade. So from 1900 to 1929, these new thoughts are the place that now these leaders are serving God's purpose in their generation. So you get 1909, that pioneering effort that John and Lydia led into. Now you see more development work. The Oregon State Business Association was incorporated. So that's our association's founding date. By 1910, you've got the ministerial associations formed to handle credentialing and clergy concerns. So you've got kind
Mhm.
of two development vehicles that are needed for different purposes. You've got worldwide things, World War I taking place, the Spanish flu pandemic, which
Mhm.
is an interesting one for us to look back on, having gone through COVID-19. And then you get this change where, we know the roaring 20s were just about this growth, progress, wealth, and all of that. Then the stock market crash in 1920 really shifts everything. It's in the midst of that context that 8 churches are planted during that time. Then you go into that stock market crash leads to this era, Great Depression and World War II, 29 to 1945. The Depression is for 10 years, 29 to 39, and it's in the middle of that the Pacific Bible College is established. Another key part that the association steps out into, they're wanting to train and equip ministers for the field. You get World War II happening from 39 to 45. We didn't want to enter into this war. We kind of get pulled into it. We respond. We come out on the other side as a true world leader on the other side of World War II. And it's during that time frame Pacific Bible College moved from Spokane to Portland. And it's in that context. I think it's interesting that in Great Depression era time frame, 13 churches are planted. So you can see that hard, gritty work of development still happening during that time frame. Think about ongoing social changes as we get to 1945 to 1968. Some of our hearers are going to find their origins in this particular era here. But look at the huge list of things that are taking place. I had to change my font size to get it all to work.
Yeah.
In 48, you get a bylaw committee established to form bylaws. So now they're getting more structure to their organization, again, more development work. You've got the Korean War, the Civil Rights Movement, how that affects, you know, our movement that wants to take the hand of every blood-washed one out of the Civil War and Reconstruction mindset. And now here we are, trying to work out how does this work. And we didn't do this stuff really well as a whole movement. What happens is we get our first point leader, Edgar Bush, who's called and employed. The title is state evangelist. I've got
Mhm.
the bracketed 4 there because he served for 4 years. It
Mhm.
seems that people saw the need for a reinvigoration of evangelism, which I would couch under the pioneering language. You
Right.
saw all this development. Now we need to re-engage in more pioneering work. And so Edgar Bush did a lot of work to support churches that were considered weaker, if you will, or struggling. But also it was kind of like calling back to like camp meetings and tent
Mhm.
revivals, it
Yeah.
seems. So he
Yeah.
was doing a lot to reinvigorate at that time. You get the Vietnam War, Camp White Branch is established in 58. And then also shortly after that, Dwight Brown, Paula's dad,
Mhm.
becomes the state evangelist. What's interesting is that you get a nice contrast. Truth Along the Trail hits on this, that where you clearly hear language describing Edgar as a pioneer evangelist, you get much more developmental language from Dwight Brown. He serves for 9 years as state evangelist, but his work looks very different. He builds
Yeah.
and actually aids in the construction of so many of our buildings. The number that I'm remembering, this needs to be kind of fact checked, was 30 or 31 churches, buildings themselves were built during this time frame
Mhm.
because that was the developmental need of those fledgling or younger congregations. And again, he played a part serving God's purposes in his generation, and his gifts and skills were used there. 59, you get the college becomes Warner Pacific College, so a name change and growth happens out of all of that. The pills introduced in the United States in 1960, another technological change that has radical impact, positive and negative, in our world. And then you get from 60 to 80, the fourth great awakening takes place. Again, this is contended. Not everybody agrees with this, but this Jesus people movement that many of us have roots in or have been affected by takes place there. That's the hippies come to Jesus. And then you've got JFK assassinated. I think a really important part with both the Vietnam War and uh, the undercurrents of kind of conspiracy and
Mhm.
questions that were going on. JFK really does, for a lot more people, seem to like remove the innocence of America. Like, what is going on here? And then Dwight resigns in 67. And then it's interesting, the association doesn't hire anybody in that point person role for 15 years.
Mhm.
And so there's no state evangelist or any work there. If I remember the quote correctly from Truth Along the Trail, they said something like, um, that the appointed volunteer leaders felt that they had the capacity to continue to lead out in those things.
Mhm.
That's very valid, more of a decentralized model for that
Mhm.
time
Yeah.
frame. So that context, 14 churches are planted. I think to even just pause and comment, the number of churches planted here, I'm using the records that we have from our yearbook
Mhm.
from this last year to state the year churches were planted or recognized as being founded. So that's the system that I'm using to be able to put those numbers there. That doesn't account for the churches that were planted and aren't in existence at this point. And if I remember correctly, there were 41 churches that were planted and are no longer in existence. So that doesn't even account for any of the numbers that I've listed so far or will continue to list. So now we get into much more of a modern era, the space race and energy crisis, 69 to 79. You've got Watergate, another break in like, can we trust the systems and places of authority in our world, and crumbling there that we see still largely in effect.
Mhm.
Younger generations, in particular, looking back suspiciously at systems of organization, organized religion, or political structures, or anytime you see power and authority like converging, there's usually a lot of questions because of experiences that have happened that way. It's interesting that you see the church planting really dramatically slow down for
Mhm.
that 10-year time frame. One church planted during that time. You get into the Reagan era and dot-com advent. This is 1980 to 2000. And so, a big shift that takes place here. 1982, now we've got a new point leader, Ray
Mhm.
Tuttle, employed as the state coordinator. Even think about the language. We go from
Mhm.
state evangelist, pioneering language, to coordinator. I'd say much more developmental language. Um, and so he serves for 7 years. You've got the World Wide Web created in 89, another technological change we're still living out of.
Mhm.
Uh, our association starts an endowment that places us for the future. We're living into and receiving the benefits of those decisions in 89. Sam Dunbar, the author of Truth Along the Trail, comes to lead as the state coordinator for 12 years during that time frame. Jerry, if you go back and look at all of the Truth Along the Trail,
Yeah.
there's a young Jerry and Chris in there
Back in
involved in
1990.
church planting. Yeah. So during that time frame, and then you get the Gulf War, and it's during that time frame two churches are planted during that time. Now, kind of the recent chapter that we've come out of, 2001 to 2019, uh, really largely shaped and changed, like the page turns because of September 11th. And so you've got 9/11 happening, and that shift that takes place in our world and in our nation. Dave Shrout comes to lead in 2001, leads for 16 years. Now, as the district pastor, there were larger changes. This is matching kind of other associations and states, and they were now using district pastor language. And so you can see matching with that. The Iraq War takes place out of all of that from September 11th. The pursuit of weapons of mass destruction and the questions that come along there. Saddam Hussein. Jerry becomes the district pastor in 2017. And then Warner Pacific changes its name to Warner Pacific University, another step of development where, it's no longer a Bible college that's looking to develop uh, ministers for the field,
Mhm.
it's
Right.
really grown and developed where its impact and the way that Warner Pacific is serving God's purposes for its generation today is largely changed because the
Mhm.
context has changed. Their strengths and weaknesses have changed, and they really are poised as a unique university for this day and age. Now, there's loads of questions. Church of God leaders have a lot of questions about, wait a minute, where is Warner Pacific gone? And I can speak, in a sense as a board member that these are definitely being addressed. These are questions and conversations that are being played out there. So I think again, another growth pattern that takes place. 2018, Pacific Coast Collective established. Jerry, you and I knew one another before this, but we were
Mhm.
both there
Right.
at the founding of the Pacific Coast Collective, this initiative to be able to see a new day of common work from Alaska down to Southern California, as all of the regional pastors, that language had kind of even changed at that point.
Mhm. Right.
Um, we're looking to work together. How can we increase efficiencies, share workloads, work across district boundaries, and play well together? And so it was during that era that 4 churches were planted. And then here we go. This is the chapter,
Mhm.
still relatively new, that we're in for this day. And so, again, serving God's purposes for our generation. And this chapter looks different. COVID-19 shifted and changed everything. You didn't expect taking that role, that just
Mhm.
years later we'd have a global pandemic, but from 2020 to the present, we've got this as our context. We've got this increasingly secular post-Christian culture. It had been happening, so it's not that it didn't happen before then, but again, we really can't argue those things. We're seeing it happen, the effects of it. You've got MTD. This is a phrase that, again, isn't founded in this era, but we're living in the context of it. Moral therapeutic deism. If that's not language that's familiar to you, go back and do a Google search and start researching it, because honestly, this is really the religion of our day. So
Yeah,
we're going to share the
absolutely.
gospel. We've got to recognize we're sharing the gospel into this spiritual framework.
Mhm.
Moral therapeutic deism also has probably deeply penetrated almost every one of our churches. And
Yeah.
so, if it, as a pastor or leader hearing this, maybe that's not your framework for looking at the world, but my guess is many people in your church actually have that as a moral framework. We've got a highly polarized country at the aid of social media, at the along the dividing lines politically. We're very polarized. A lot of it came out of coronavirus, or showed its
Mhm.
face even more, mask or no mask, lockdown or no lockdown. I mean, just so many things have come out, and it's still reverberating. It wouldn't be difficult for me to state an opinion right here and have people listening to this polarized because they disagree with, that maybe a decision or a perspective that I have here. That's kind of the context, even inside of the church. The pandemic happens, and then in 23, 3 years later, Fred Douglas and myself joined Jerry and Paula as a regional team. I mark this not just because I play a part in there, but the innovation that, Jerry, you are utilizing to pioneer this is actually a really unique one. I don't know of another place, state, association, or region out of the US and Canada that's employing the same type of strategy. So it really is a unique one, and I think something that brings a lot of strength to the table for this next season. And then here we are, 2024, this really
Mhm.
inflammatory election year.
Are you being
You know,
prophetic there, Michael?
I am not trying to be. I think I'm rightly
I
describing
think you are.
how
Yeah.
it's shaping up, and it is.
Yeah.
It's tiring to see, honestly, the way that it's shaping up. It does
Yep.
feel like, seriously, this is what we're looking at as options. And then, of course, a lot of us are looking at it like, no matter which way it goes on the other side, what will be the consequences?
Right.
Yeah. And so that's where we are. So how do we serve God's purposes in the midst of this? And so the other part I've got here is just that as we look at, the way that Church of God plays out, we do carry a value for autonomy. that autonomy has meant to release and empower people at the local level to do the call of God for their lives. But our autonomy oftentimes leads to a rugged independence. Independence is something that we carry because of, the American influence we have, the Declaration of Independence, the Lone Ranger kind of mentality. And so we have a proclivity to land in that, to just be ruggedly independent and separate. And I really do think we need to be working together and figure out how to be able to walk in that unity that we long to and not let autonomy separate us further. So far in this context, there are 0 churches planted at this point. So that's the big picture. Those are the 13 chapters. I'll pause there, Jerry. Give me some thoughts as you're seeing it now, technically for a third time, Jerry.
Yeah.
Sheesh.
Yeah, no, great stuff. And as I was thinking about it, the innovation of the Transcontinental Railroad and
Yep.
thinking about how that influenced the planting of churches. It seemed like,
Yep.
pastors or church leaders would come with their gospel trumpet and would jump off the train, set up a tent, and have a revival. And
Yeah.
out of that pioneering would come some developing of a
Yep.
church,
Beautiful.
oftentimes. And so
Yeah.
that that struck me, this presentation.
Yeah.
Another thing that I was thinking about too was, while we don't talk about it in this, well, you didn't talk about it in this presentation, but the importance of women in ministry,
Ooh, thank
in
you.
in
Yeah.
our history, not only in ministry, but as educators in our
So
university
good.
or
Thank you.
college. I mean, um, and and when we think about kind of the polarized church, the polarized society we have,
Yep.
you know, we're still fighting that battle. It seems like, you
So
know,
good.
complementarians and
Yeah.
egalitarians are
Yeah.
duking it out, and we hold just the importance of women
Absolutely.
and their call to ministry, and yeah,
Yeah. That's
and
really good.
and then I wouldn't necessarily call that pioneering, but I think you know we're still I think we as a movement are still leaning into that. So
Yeah. Absolutely.
yeah,
That's really good.
that's
Yeah, I
awesome.
think as I'll respond in turn. So that transcontinental railroad, yeah, it is interesting how technological changes in transportation made it
Mhm.
easier and were leveraged then for that new work. And then those strategies that you then described, set up a tent, gospel trumpet, um, those fit that paradigm. Well, now,
Mhm.
if Jerry, you and I said, hey, this is what we're going to do for the region, we're going to use the railroad system and we're going to
Right.
find hubs like that's silly. And so you can
Yeah.
see the way that
Yeah.
pioneering, you've got to think about what are changes in that case where people are gathered and how we can interact with them. And so we live in a really unique time now that others haven't had to face.
Yeah.
It's a global world. Our
Yeah.
communication systems can allow us where right now you and I don't need to leave our homes and travel the 4 hours it would require for us to be together. And so how do we use and leverage technologies of either transportation or communication to meet people where they are? Yeah, that's interesting. And then on the women in ministry, I'm so glad you brought that up. In fact, I think that's probably something that I need to go back and adjust this so that that's rightly included. Because like in this particular slide, I would add the JET, the Justice and Equity Task
Yep.
Force, just
Definitely.
presenting
Mm.
their document. It's a great resource. And I think it does tell the story of how we pioneered work, because taking the hand of every blood wash one included gender and racial lines.
Yeah.
And so here we are releasing and empowering women in such beautiful ways in those early time frames. But it does feel like you brought up complementarianism and egalitarianism. We then, just like we did along racial lines,
Mhm.
we gave in to social
Yep.
norms. And though you see women in ministry still happening in the Church of God, and conceptually there's some sense of agreement, in practice there are a lot of people barring women from
Yeah.
ministry. And so that document, I just finished reading through it, it does help to see that. So I'm so grateful that as an association, we absolutely want to release and empower, support, remove hurdles from women leading. because we need the whole body in operation. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so I put this and front loaded that long conversation with these two words, pioneering and developing. I promise we're landing the plane pretty soon with this. And so, but just to talk a little bit more, I put them on a spectrum here because they do tend to be opposite in nature. Many of us might be more of a pioneering mindset. And sometimes we might look at developers as like, oh, you're always holding up the change that could be. I know that some of us are developers in mind, and we might look at pioneers like, oh, you're always trying to go into something new. Can't you just finish what we already started? And so these oftentimes are at odds. There's both immature and mature versions of these. To go through immature pioneers, like the accusations that developers might have for them, are like moving forward, constant expansion that leaves just ghost towns in the wake. You can see historical images of that kind of stuff. You can think about how a person who might be immature just continually moves on to new things regularly. But the immature version of a developer is, like this extreme preservation that calcifies the pioneering spirit. And because they're immature versions, both of them could easily defend their stuff. The pioneer might say, you're just stuck in the mud. You're just I'm going to go do this thing because the call of God is on, like we can easily justify what we do. Whereas the developer can say, we got to care for people. We've got to love people. We can't. And so both of those can lead toward alienation, separation. So we do need to move from immature versions of it. What I've found too, from kind of traveling with three-dimensional ministries and using some of this language as we communicated with people, we recognized that in general, largely 70% of the church population were developers. So the majority of, and thank God, honestly, for that, and 30% were pioneers. The other thing that we noticed is that churches tended toward, I think because of the majority, tended toward development and conservation. And what happened is they didn't always create places for pioneers to play. And so a lot of times the movement would be that pioneers would leave the church or the local church and go establish a new pioneering work, as a not-for-profit, parachurch organization. And so if you go back historically and look, a lot of times parachurch organizations are established because the local church, it fits under their vision, but they weren't willing to go take those risks that kind of work was moving into. So the mature versions of it, you've got mature pioneers who recognize that, yes, let's explore. Yes, let's move into new frontier, but let's do it sustainably. That's really important. So they recognize that pace is really important. Moving the community along is important. And then mature developers recognize, again, notice that it's just being self-aware that my natural bend needs to include the other. So it's establishing roots, but in the frontier that had recently been developed, but with the idea that this needs to continue on. I'm not creating a monument out of this new move of God. I'm actually working in it, developing it, but preparing it for that next future development here. So give me some thoughts before I give these 4 final points that I think we need to really work on with pioneering and developing.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I think it's a good distinction between those that are mature and immature. I mean, we need both, right?
We do.
Not immature and
absolutely.
mature. We need both mature pioneers and mature developers.
Yes, we do.
Need each other. Can't do it alone.
Yeah. So my admonition to the district team, to the district council, to the whole association is we've got to learn how to maintain this tension. Because if we swing one way or the other only, then we're going to succumb to the strength and the weakness of that particular angle. We've got to learn how to do both of this and hold the tension, create a space where developers can develop and be themselves, and we can walk in honor toward them. We don't need to speak negatively if we come from a pioneering perspective. Same thing is true. We don't need to speak negatively about pioneers or Just ask them to be tame. We need each different type of group of people to ruggedly be themselves, but to hold that tension together. Not just finding a place in the middle, because think about it, movement. There should be
Right.
this natural pendulum swinging where we recognize those things. We need to maintain that tension so that the pendulum swings. So I think step one, we got to recognize and have this conversation. What season are we in?
Yeah.
In this era, are we in more of a developing season or are we in more of a pioneering season? I've got my thoughts. I'm not going to put them out there for right now because I think the big picture is hold that tension. We got to create a culture, like I've already mentioned, where that embraces both the pioneering spirit and that developing spirit. We need to use language to walk in honor toward, empower one another.
Yep.
And then we need to mobilize and release people and resources and energy toward collective kingdom initiatives with both pioneers and developers looking at how are we going to move into this stuff together and support each other. So that's kind of the main thing that I really want the team, the council, and the association to hear. I think these are conversations that need to happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
So here it is, Jerry. We've already got
Church of
the
God
Church of God
Northwest.
Northwest name. We revealed that in that last one. Now here we are at the end of this long marathon. And so the vision that we have wrestled with, that we have talked through as a team, we've presented back to the district council and had their support with this language is this. The vision we want to live out in order to kind of see the gospel of the kingdom extended is that we want to do pioneering and developing a Jesus shaped landscape in Oregon and Washington. So we want to lean into those words, pioneering and developing. In a sense, we're already maintaining some sense of tension by just putting it out there like that. What we want to produce, the language we landed on, is a Jesus-shaped landscape. So we're using landscape language to kind of talk about geography, place that we find ourselves in, but we want it to be shaped by the life of Jesus. And then we can name that differently. Oregon and Washington, we want to include both states, but we could say in the Northwest, on the Pacific coast. We could use that and broaden that in quite a few different areas. But behind this is that idea of recognizing we need to do both of these, recognizing what season we're in and pushing together in unity to be able to see a Jesus-shaped landscape develop around us further.
Yeah. That's it. That's the vision. I love the Jesus language. As disciples of his, as apprentices of Jesus, we're leaning into. And really it speaks to the kingdom, right?
It does.
Jesus came to proclaim the kingdom. We're so we are in essence taking that kingdom, trying to shape it in Oregon and Washington and beyond for sure.
Yep, absolutely. You can use this in collaboration, in a sense. I think this allows us to play really well with the other associations in an ongoing way too. Like this is recognizing where we're wanting to do these kind of things as we play at the Pacific Coast Collective or with one region in particular, at a time where we wanted to continue to do this and leverage the strength that we bring to the table, recognizing what we don't bring to the table, and then using that as we see fit, patterned after the life of Jesus. Yep. Awesome. I'll pull that down and
really good. Hey, thanks, Michael, for walking us through this. Thanks everybody for hanging in there and not fast forwarding through some of it, getting to the end. We've got a lot more to talk about in terms of, so where does that vision take us, right? And it obviously takes us to some values, to some initiatives, to some, as we've been talking, some vehicles.
Yes.
How we can help our churches, our pastors, our leaders, kind of lean into that vision and work it out in their time so that when, the end of their life comes or the end of whatever comes, we can say, hey, we lived out our purpose in this generation, and then we got eaten by worms.
Yeah, right.
I don't know. No. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Great conversation. Look forward to some more.
Thanks very much. Bless you guys.
Bless you.